Story 1 by Reddit user NatSp1976. A little background on me and that day. I work in real estate, more exactly commercial real estate, so my work takes me all over the place from urban industrial areas to very off-the-beaten-path secluded areas, farmlands, development lands, etc. On this day in particular, in October of 2012, my last assignment of the day was to go out and survey an old farmstead near Cayuga in Haldimand County, about 30 miles south of Hamilton, Ontario. The place had been vacant since the 90s. I arrived in the late afternoon, say around 5:30ish. The place was the last one on a dead-end country road, and couldn't be seen from the road. I went up the long driveway and proceeded to do my look-over of the place. There were 3 structures: the house, a garage, and a large tool shed. I walked around the front of the house, which was completely boarded up, with no means of seeing inside. I proceeded around the far side toward the other buildings. The shed was basically fallen completely down, but the garage was mostly completely still up. I noticed around the side man door a lot of huge scratches, and the door was like half broken down, but still held shut by a padlock on one side, and in the middle, and up a hinge. The bottom part was forced inward, and the door and clapboards around it were covered with these scratches. But not like scratches a dog would leave. These scratches were huge and parallel, but spread apart, almost like fingernail scratches, and very deep, obviously put there with a lot of pressure. That's when I look down and see huge paw prints, but not regular round paw prints, almost elongated a little bit. The area around this partially broken down door was covered with these paw prints. If I had to venture a guess at how wide they were, I would say at least 5 inches. I was wearing heeled dress boots, and when I put my foot over the paw print, I could see the print on the other side of my foot. And I wear a size 10, so I don't have tiny feet by any means. I began to get very uneasy, and that's when I recalled noticing that all the sounds of the forest were gone. It was dead silent, and that is when I noticed that stench, like wet dog urine and feces. I mean, the whole area just smelled rotten like a swamp, rot and decay. But this smell was strong and very putrid. I got very uneasy, like all of a sudden I knew I wasn't alone, and I decided I'd seen enough and quickly headed back to my car. That is when I heard something in the bushes, and it sounded big and it was going through the trees very quickly and hard. I got back to my car, I got in and locked the doors. When I started my car and turned the lights on, that's when I caught the eyes reflecting in the trees ahead of me. But the eye shine was not at the level a dog's head to be at. It was a lot higher. I would say 4 to 5 feet up. Maybe even a bit higher. I could not make out a shape as it was getting toward dusk, so there were a lot of shadows in the trees. But I thought I saw a large figure in the trees. But I couldn't be sure. I started to freak out a little bit and decided it was time to go. So I backed around right into a wet marshy spot and kind of got my car stuck. I was more interested in watching this thing than where I was going, which was a mistake. My attention quickly went back to the car as I tried to free myself from the mud. When I looked back to where this thing was, it was gone. The spot it was I could see further into the trees, so there was definitely something there, but I could not see exactly a shape. More so just a large, shadowy figure. After several seconds of rocking my car back and forth, I managed to get out, and I left very quickly. I don't think I have ever been so scared in my life. Like I said, I did not clearly see what it was, but I just had the intense feeling of evil. Something bad was there. I returned to that spot about 1.5 years after the incident, and the place is gone. Someone bought the property and tore it down and cut down a lot of the trees, but to the best of my knowledge, nothing has been developed there. It's just still vacant land. I've not really told anyone of this, as I don't want to be ridiculed or made fun of. A co-worker said it was probably a bear, but I know for a fact there are no bears this far south in Ontario, unless it's in a zoo. I had long forgotten about this, till I recently saw a video on YouTube about someone's encounter with something very similar to what I described. I handled the sale of some farmland on the nearby, to the place I experienced this, Six Nations Indian Reservation. The client was easily in his 80s, if not older. I asked him about odd happenings in the area, like strange animals, and I sort of told him about my experience. Not in detail, just that I was on that property. He responded with a question. "You saw it, didn't you?" He went on to say there are many things that are unknown to this world, but wouldn't comment further about my experience. Only said there is good reason that particular place has sat empty and unused for decades. I had the odd nightmare of that day for about a year afterwards, and I'm still very hesitant to do surveys in areas like that. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say thank you for selecting to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you like my storytelling, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It really does help me out. Thank you. Story 2. This story has been written by the Reddit user The Dude Abides 80. I posted this on the subreddit Cryptozoology a while back and had a range of responses including Dogman and Black Shuck. I had initially ruled out Dogman as what I saw looked like a giant dog on all fours, not bipedal. Anyway, you guys read what I saw and let me know what you think. This happened about 6 years back. Back then I lived in a small village just outside of Sherborne, Dorset in the UK. I can't remember exactly when, but I think it was about December or January time as it was freezing cold outside and I'd just left a parents' evening at school. Worked in Yeovil as a teacher and was driving home about 8 p.m. and it was dark already. So I was knackered, had my radio on and did the 20-minute drive home. The car was heating up, so I was starting to feel comfy and sleepy as I drove through Sherborne out into the Dorset countryside towards home. My house was situated down a single-lane road with woods on one side and big fields on the other. As I turn into the road, I slam my brakes on, as there's something big in the road. It takes me a while to figure out that it's a giant dog in the middle of the road leaving the fields and heading into the woods. This thing was bigger than the front of my car. Its head must have been at least 5 foot off the ground. It looked like a giant German shepherd with dark fur all over from my brief impression, and it was just stood there in profile with my headlights on it. Its head was turned towards me, and its lips were drawing back and the snarl was terrifying. Honestly, not sure if it was the adrenaline or tiredness, but I've only been terrified like that in nightmares. I didn't wait to see what it did. I reversed back onto the road and went and had a pint in a pub back in Sherborne and Googled what I saw. I didn't find anything specific to the area. I finally found the courage to drive back, and it had gone. I park as close to my front door as possible and sprint to it with my keys ready to get inside. I was a 33-year-old teacher and felt ridiculous. I spent a good few hours just looking out the window seeing if I could spot anything, which I didn't, and I never did again. Story 3. This story has been written by Reddit user Jedi_Master_Bates. That's Bates spelt Baytes. These are my encounters with the creatures known as dogmen while living in Kentucky. They still haunt me to this day, and I thought I'd share them with you all. Story number 1. I was 8 years old, living in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. It was the summer of 2012, and it was a hot one. One summer night, I woke at 11:30 or 12, and I was sweating like hell, so I walked over to the window to crack it. That's when I saw something in the tree line by our stock pond. We owned no animals other than a small terrier, but the previous owners were commercial farmers, I watched for about 5 minutes before it emerged, and when it did, I was horrified. It was a wolf-like creature about 6 to 7 feet tall and partially covered in dark grey hair that shone in the light of the full moon. It walked on 2 legs, and then very quickly dropped on all fours and ran the 100 or so yards to the stock pond in mere seconds. It drank for a while, then stood up on 2 legs again, and I got a really good look at it. The thing was horrible looking. The fur was all patchy, very skinny, and it looked like it was covered in some kind of injuries. Years later, when I saw the 3rd Harry Potter movie for the first time, I saw the werewolf, and that's almost exactly what it looked like. It then took off across the old cornfield and into the woods on the other side. I had heard stories of the creature, but never really believed them until that night. I heard a week later, while out around town with my folks, that there had been an attack at a nearby farm, and 3 hogs and 1 horse had been eaten and ripped to shreds. That was my first, but not last encounter with a dogman. Story number 2. I caught glimpses of the things consistently ever since that first sighting, but never got a good look at one of them until fall of 2015, a month before we moved to Maine. It was dusk, and I was outside with some of my friends playing with our Nerf guns as some young boys do. Those were the good days. Anyways, after a while we got bored and started a fire. We told dirty jokes and laughed for a while, but then we started hearing noises in the woods, and the laughter died down. We all retreated to the woodshed and armed ourselves with axes, pitchforks and the like before returning to the fire. About 10 minutes later, something rustled in the woods about 20 yards behind us, but no one dared to look to see what the hell it was. Finally, my friend Jeremy turned around to look, and the scream he let out could have brought down the barn roof. That's when we all turned around and saw one of them. Except this one was much taller, I'd say 8.5 to 9 feet, and it was pure muscle and grey hair. It was on all fours sniffing around the barn, but when Jeremy screamed, the thing looked at us, stood up on 2 legs, and snarled. That's when my dad came out of the house with his shotgun and screamed, "What in God's name is going on?" We all just pointed and screamed. Then he looked at it, yelled, "Go on, git," and shot at it twice. It ran into the woods yelping, as I think it had been hit, and we all went inside and locked the doors. My dad sat in his chair with a shotgun the whole night, and I swore I could hear scratching along the side of the house until daylight. Turns out, when we went outside the next morning, there were claw marks all over the side of the house. After that, everything was quiet until we moved, and I've never seen anything like that since. Story 4. This story has been written by Torvosaurus428. It's not too often that one reports seeing or having indications of a cryptid with a normal animal. If they are believed to be real, however, humans can't be the only things they interact with, and not every animal out there is vulnerable. This was not a report I myself witnessed, but instead one my grandmother told me about that my aunt later corroborated independently, so I think they're trustworthy. At the time, I'll note there wasn't much talk of dogmen, as this was about a decade before the infamous song came out, though there was talk of wolves or werewolf-like monsters in Appalachia for a long time, so my aunt and grandmother always just called it that wolf thing or creature. For a little background, my grandparents' currently aunt's home is in backwoods of western Grayson County, Virginia, which to this day is still sparsely populated outside of 1 or 2 large towns on the east side, and back then it was even less so. Extremely thick forest with hilly terrain in all directions. You have to get on a dirt path and follow it for about half a mile to get to a gravel-covered side road, and then follow it for about 30 minutes to reach a very small town just across the North Carolina border. If you go a short ways north, you find yourself at Blue Ridge Mountains and the parkway that leads up into Appalachia proper. The forest is mostly low-lying shrubs up to around 4 feet high, with pine and a lot of black oak trees making up the canopy. There is a very clear stream about 30 yards from the house, which has fish quite frequently. This, along with wild blackberries, tender leaf shrubs, and some apple trees, make it very lucrative for wildlife. The house itself is an old 2-story house built onto an incline of the hill that overlooks it. This takes place in the 1970s. My aunt believes it was 1978 as she was finishing high school at the time. My father had graduated from college and was going on to the Air Force, so he had already moved out. My grandfather, although he was old enough to retire, liked to remain busy, so he worked his old job as an electrician and power pole technician, just now in an advisory role because he was getting up there in years. He had just gotten the contract down in North Carolina, so he was away from the house for about a week and a half. This left only my 17-year-old aunt and grandmother at the house. As I said, there usually was a lot of wildlife in the area. A typical morning for my grandmother was making breakfast and sitting out on her porch watching deer and rabbits eat at the shrubs. Sometimes she would also see or hear a bobcat, fox, or coyote about. On one occasion, a mountain lion and her cubs strolled right past the house. One animal she was familiar with in particular was a very large black bear who could be recognized by folks around those parts from a white patch on his chest and a hole in his left ear. My grandmother nicknamed him Captain because he had a habit of sitting on his haunches and reaching up with his paws to pick apples, a motion that looked like he was saluting. Captain was a very big black bear, but he wasn't very aggressive unless tested. He seemed to have an agreement with my grandmother and grandfather that if they left him alone, he would leave them alone. He just strolled by the house every now and then to have some blackberries on the bushes or apples that had fallen down, which meant he came by the house's yards often as he was too big to climb trees much more, and the fruit trees around the house were low enough he could reach up and pick food. My grandfather guesstimated he was somewhere in the 500 to 600 pound range, and roughly 6 feet tall as my grandfather once measured some scratch marks he left on a tree. During the week, my grandmother noticed a fairly sharp decline in the animals nearby. It was the latter part of summer and a wet season, so most of the plants were in full bloom and the leaves were at their tenderest. Yet she couldn't see hide nor hair of any rabbits or deer coming to graze. A coyote she heard yapping every night for the past month seemed to vanish. A few neighbours, by neighbours I mean people who live within 5 miles, who stopped by told her something had taken their dog and their chicken coop had been smashed into. They assumed the mountain lion that lurked about had done it, since it was the only other thing that could feasibly take down a large farm dog, as they had seen Captain, the only other predator nearby big enough to take down an 80-pound-plus farm dog, the day after, in a completely different area, gorging himself on a dead deer. They checked around, but couldn't find anything. The next night, my grandmother was woken up by my aunt, who told her that she heard something bang against the outside of her wall. They checked around in the morning after, and found one of the deer butchered with a bloody smear on the wall. Judging from the way the gravel was disturbed, the deer had been walking by the house when something ambushed it, and in the struggle, it got smacked against the wall. My grandmother, having grown up in the woods, was familiar with predator kills and methods. Mountain lions tend to jump on the back and rake their claws across the flanks to hold on as they bite the neck. Black bears will usually break the neck or back with their paws while biting the head. And the rare occasions coyotes attack deer, they usually do it by biting down on the inside of the leg and twisting to rip the muscle and arteries. This kill clearly had the throat ripped out, but there weren't any claw marks to be found, and the bite looked narrower than what a cougar would do. Plus, she could gander there was only one predator from the way the ground had been disturbed, which didn't make sense for coyotes as they typically hunted in pairs since just one alone isn't usually enough to bring down a full-grown deer. After disposing of the carcass, the next few nights were relatively uneventful, except for the fact that several times my aunt or grandmother would be woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of something panting outside. Now, in these woods you can hear a pin drop if it's close enough, and at some points they could swear the animal making the panting was directly outside the wall. One day, my grandmother was picking some berries when she noticed what looked like dog tracks of a very large hound going through a mud flat bordering the nearby stream. Thinking it might be the missing farm dog who had maybe just run away, she followed the tracks until she heard something loudly growling at her from across the stream. She looked up to see the partially obscured face of what looked like a large, bulky, brown-coloured coyote or wolf standing in a thicket on the other side of the stream. She quickly began to back away, glancing back only to check her footing on the slope that led down to the stream. When she looked back, she saw the very distinctly canine face in much greater detail because the animal had moved out from under cover. But instead of stepping out of the leaves like she thought it did at first, she soon noticed that it was instead standing up on its hind legs and peering over the shrubs. Now, she had seen canines stand upright before. Dogs do it, foxes can do it, coyotes sometimes do it. It was the size that took her off guard. She had been to that exact same thicket of shrubs just the other day, and her head only just barely reached the top, and my grandmother was around 5'3". This thing had its head pitched clear over the shrubs with a little bit of extra visible. And usually, when a predator is making no attempt to hide, it's usually because it's trying to intimidate someone. My grandmother managed to back away to the hill without turning around, and when she started to get out of sight, the creature stepped out of the thicket onto its hind legs. It strolled forward in a very uncanny way she had trouble describing, but she insisted it never went back down on all fours. Needless to say, she ran into the house on a backpedal sprint. That night they heard the panting again, along with a distant howl and scraping sounds. They found the garage door, back door frame and kitchen window frame all had claw marks on them from something, when investigating them. The canine creature was seen a few more times across the week by my grandmother and the neighbours, usually on or near the area of my family's property. My aunt finally saw it when she saw a pair of fuzzy ears outside her window. Now, she wasn't startled right off the bat from this, as Captain had come by her window a few times before, and she gradually lost some fear of the big bear over the years. But in this case, his ears just barely reached the edge of the windowsill, whereas in this case, you could clearly see them and the top of the owner's head. She quickly realized it wasn't the bear because of the pointed shape, brown coloring, and the fact that it had 2 fully intact ears. They also started to detect a very pungent smell on a side door porch, one time finding what looked like some urine or some other liquid stains on it, suggesting an animal had scent marked it to claim the spot. It all came to a head on a Wednesday night when they heard howling in the distance grow closer. My grandmother flipped on a porch light and glimpsed the canine animal quickly sprinting across the lawn on its hind legs, her sighting confirming how big it was. She'd seen timber wolves at the zoo up to 150 pounds, and she was certain this was at least a bit more than twice that size. For several hours of the night, they could hear it roaming around the property and pressing against the doors like it was trying to find a way in. They glimpsed at several points eyeshine of yellow eyes peering in through the windows, as well as broad, long-fingered paws being pushed against the glass briefly. This was the day and age before cell phones and 24-hour police service in some rural areas, so no one had the means of immediately calling the police. Instead, my grandmother had to wait arduous minutes on a dial tone with connection difficulty trying to call the police station 2 towns over. She was distracted by my aunt screaming, running into the bedroom to get one of the guns out. She had been sitting in the living room when she felt clicking against the glass and saw that wolf thing pressing its face and baring its teeth against the surface with its claws out fully stretched. Both of them started to try to get the rifles or shotguns out. It was becoming increasingly clear the creature was trying to get into the house and knew they were in there. They heard it panting through a wall before there was the sound of heavy footsteps and a very loud thump, with a flash of fur on the edge of the window. They ran into the innermost room, the pantry locker, and stayed in there with the guns. Now, it's not like in the movies where creatures roar, snarl, and hiss constantly no matter what they're doing, but they did hear a commotion outside. My aunt and grandmother hadn't the faintest idea what was going on and didn't investigate until the morning after, but they could tell something was antagonizing something else, as occasional grunts, barks, and rumbles were audible through the blackness for about a minute and gradually moved off. They found no bodies, but there'd clearly been a ferocious altercation. The ground was ripped up in multiple spots, the wall had a dent on it, and there were some oxidized blood traces on the grass and dirt. My grandmother also found a trail where something had charged through the shrubs and recovered several vague dog prints as well as wider tracks moving in the same direction. The animals all seemed to come back by the end of the week, and the howling stopped. When my grandfather came back home, he, my aunt, and some neighbours surveyed the area to make sure they couldn't find the wolf creature. Evidently, the neighbours had also heard howls around their property at night that stopped recently too. They couldn't find it despite surveying the whole property, though they did find what looked like a trackway leading out of the property and running off into the mountains. Several days later, my grandmother saw Captain again, marking his territory by rubbing up against a tree in their yard and scratching the bark. He had several cuts across his muzzle, was missing patches of fur, had some healed bite wounds on his arm, and the hole in his ear had been torn open to the point he was missing half the ear flap. But other than that, and a slight limp that went away with time, he was fine. My aunt joked he looked rather proud of himself. When he was told about the urine-like smell on the doorstep when the wolf creature was running amok, my grandfather speculated it was trying to claim the territory. Usually black bears are relatively docile, but evidently Captain took issue with this newcomer imposing on his space and became aggressive. So what my grandmother and aunt heard that one night was the bear charging while it was distracted and engaging the intruder. While the wolf-looking creature was taller, it seemed skinnier and less massive. And apparently in a confrontation and threat displays that likely followed, sheer bulk won out. Apparently it decided it wasn't worth claiming this spot if it meant having to square off with a quarter-ton of claws and teeth for it. Captain had run the intruder off to protect his territory and coincidentally helped my family. As a thank you and so he could recover his strength quicker, my grandmother trimmed the apple trees to down all the fruit and let the bear enjoy himself without feeding him directly. Don't want to associate humans with food. Winter would be in a few months, and she wanted him fattened up so he could stick around for the next year, just in case. As she put it, the forest will always have a boss, and it's better to have one who's not interested in eating you. Decades have gone by, and while both my grandparents and Captain have passed, the Dogman creature never returned. There's been about 3 black bears who've moved into Captain's place since, and each has grown about as big as he was. Thankfully, that seems to have been enough to ward off any large canines. Story 5 by Reddit user Dregovich, MIA. One summer night, like this, when I was at the age of 5 or 6, me and my mum were sitting at the balcony. In the kitchen next to us, in a dark, creepy corner, I can see a big, pitch-black furry form of a werewolf with sparkly yellowish eyes staring at me. It didn't move, it didn't even blink. I can remember myself staying there speechless, holding my breath for a few minutes. I was shocked. At that age, I knew such things never existed, and I was trying to make up something of it so I understood what it was. But it was so real. It was covering the LED lights of the fridge. Am I crazy? I stood there for moments. Then, it happened. It started creeping towards me, and at that moment I started crying and screaming as loud as I could. My mum told me my face turned pale, and I was trembling, but she couldn't see anything. She held me and tried calming me down when we walked to the kitchen and turned the lights on, and it seemed like it just disappeared. I couldn't sleep that night. Later, the days went by and I slowly forgot about this and never saw that wolf monstrosity thing again. Until yesterday. Now I'm 17, my mum is visiting her family for a few days and my father always comes back home late, so mostly I'm alone all day. So yesterday I was sitting in that same balcony, and in that same exact sofa I saw him again. I couldn't believe myself for a moment. I almost laughed, it was so real. The same scary form, the same eyes, the same dark, thick fur. It's been 11 plus years, and in that moment I remembered every single detail of him, like his picture was printed in my memory. I got up and walked slowly towards the kitchen. I was looking at him and he was staring back at me without blinking. Once again, I can see his eyes following me. My brain couldn't accept his presence, but my eyes were looking at him. I got so close, maybe 1.5 to 2 meters apart from him, and I swear I could hear his breathing. At that moment, I completely freaked out. My hands were already sweating, my heart started racing, and I froze there for a second. It felt like I couldn't move my legs. Part of my brain was in a complete shock, and part of it couldn't believe what I was seeing. I looked at the wall to turn the lights on. It happened in a fraction of a second. When I looked back, he just disappeared. Again. It appeared so real I can imagine his face and recall his heavy breathing right now as I am typing this. I don't know if I was hallucinating when I was younger, but I can confirm that I saw him again, and to be clear, I'm not scared of such things, but I do believe in the supernatural forces. But in that moment, at the age of 17, I was terrified. I didn't want to tell anyone because obviously they will say I'm crazy. But I can trust myself. I have no mental disorders, nothing that makes me see things. This is a 100% true story. Every detail listed happened. When it happened again yesterday, I thought I'd share it here and see what people say about it, or if there are any similar experiences, or if someone can give a possible explanation of what happened. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. Again, if you enjoyed my narration, please hit that like button, and if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. And let me know what you thought of these stories in the comment sections below, and check out the links to the original posts in the video description. Also, check out the links to my Teespring store in the video description. I have a number of t-shirt and hoodie designs with my new logo on. If you want to support my channel even further, please consider purchasing one. Finally, if you have a story you would like me to narrate on this channel, please email me at mrsinisterstories@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching.